Okay. Good evening. It's nice to see everybody. And welcome. We still have a few people trickling in, but we'll go ahead and get started. I'm going to share my screen so that you can so that you can see the blessing, and we'll share in the blessing for study together, and then we'll begin with our study. So please join me. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam asher kidshanu b'mitzvotav v'tzivanu la'asok b'divrei Torah. Blessed are you, Adonai, whose mitzvot make our lives holy, and who commands us to engage with words of Torah. So, first of all, welcome back for our third session on Maimonides. We went through all these thank yous last time, but I want to thank the members of the Adult Education Committee for helping put this together. Thank you to all of you for being here and lending your voices to this conversation. Thank you as well to our anonymous angel donor who helped make this program possible, as well as to everybody who donated toward this program. We've had a great outpouring of interest and people showing up for the sessions. So again, thank you, and it's great to see all of you. One more announcement. This is our third of 4 sessions. Our last session, which will be in 2 weeks, will be led not by me, I'll be here, but it'll be led by Professor Ken Sieskin of Northwestern University. And Professor Sieskin actually has written and published a fair amount on Maimonides. So he'll be here to kind of bat cleanup, so to speak, to give us an overview and a wrap up about what we've discussed. And so there may well be questions, and some of you have emailed me questions here and there, and sometimes things have come up and we've said, I'm not sure I know the answer to that. Those would be better for our expert, for our professor. So if there are questions like that, first of all, at the end of the night, I'll ask you what those are. So keep those in mind and let me know what they are. And second of all, you can ask them then. I'm going to let Professor Sieskin know what we've talked about over the course of 3 sessions, so that he then can can incorporate that into what he'll be talking about when he gives us his overview and his view of Maimonides' way of thinking in 2 weeks. So a little bit of review. What have we talked about over the course of the last 2 weeks? We have been introduced to one of the great thinkers of Jewish history, Maimonides, also known as the Rambam, because his name was Rabbi Moshe ben Maimon. And Rambam, I think you probably remember this from last time, but his name Rambam right here is an acronym for that name, Rabbi Moshe ben Maimon. And of course, Maimonides means the son of Maimon. So either way, Maimonides is, as we've said before, he's a rabbi and he's a physician, he's a scientist. He's also a legal thinker, a lawyer, and he's a philosopher. He really does it all in all kinds of ways, Jewishly speaking. And this may go without saying, but we have, of course, only scratched the surface of what Maimonides wrote and what he taught. We're looking more specifically at his philosophical works. What is God? What is the universe? What is the meaning of life, right? These are the small questions that we're pondering here. But Maimonides also wrote an entire legal treatise where he went through methodically telling us how to be Jewish, how to follow halakha, how specifically one practice various aspects of Judaism. So it's interesting that someone who could be a philosopher could also be a legalist, could also be a behavioralist is not the right word, but who was thinking about the ways one should act as opposed to just the ways one should think, which is what he's focused on here. And that'll become an important point as we get into our final discussion tonight, which will be much more about action and much more about our relationship with God, both in terms of what God thinks and how God and whether God cares about us, which is question number 1, and also in terms of how we relate to God through actions, which is kind of question number 2. Over the last 2 weeks, we've gotten the chance to see first how Maimonides reads the Bible, reads the Torah. And secondly, what Maimonides says that we can know and what we cannot know about God. How Maimonides reads the Torah, by way of very brief review, is that he reads it as though it must be in agreement with philosophy, with the idea of a God who is incorporeal. And so that anything that Maimonides reads in the Torah that is apparently out of sync with the idea of an incorporeal God who is so completely different from humanity and from the world must necessarily be allegory. Maimonides can't fathom the idea that God has a hand or a back, or that God exactly chooses a group of people, or that God even exactly exists. If existence is the same thing that it means for me, if I exist, then God can't possibly exist in the same way as me. Which leads us to what he really has to say about God, which is that there's very little that we can say about God. That was what we learned last week, 2 weeks ago, from Maimonides, which is that it's much easier to say what God is not than what God is. Because if we go to say, for example, something like God is wise, then we're suddenly putting God into a ballpark with ourselves. Well, I could be wise. I could become more and more wise by learning more, but I can't ever be what God is in terms of wisdom. So God and I are not on the same spectrum. We're not in the same ballpark of wisdom. Same thing for goodness. I can be good, but when I say that God is good, that doesn't mean the same thing as I do when I say that I'm good. Same thing even for existence. I exist. At least I think I exist. Mostly I'm pretty sure I exist. But God, when we say God exists, we can't mean that God exists in the same way as I exist. The words simply don't mean the same thing. And yet, we can't fathom, as far as Maimonides is concerned, that God doesn't exist, that God isn't good, that God isn't wise. So the most that we can say is essentially that God does not exist. God is not wise. God is not evil. God is not stupid. So we can say what God is not, but we cannot necessarily say what God is and know what it means. Which means that the words that we use, like wise, good, and exist, are essentially, those are us trying to give ourselves some kind of meaning about what God is. But God's existence, what God is so far outside of what we can understand that the words don't exactly mean the same thing. That's what Maimonides means when he told us in our first session that you can see God's back, but you can't see God's face. And if you remember, that was one of the best examples of him reading the Torah as allegory. There's this story where Moses says to God, "I'd like to see your face." And God says, "You can't see my face, but I'll show you my back." Now, to ancient people, that could have been literal. Many ancient gods, were understood to have physical form. But Maimonides says, no way this is literal. It simply doesn't mean that. What it means instead is that we can't possibly fathom God's essence. We can't know the things that make up God's essence. But what we can do is come into contact with the things that exist me'achor, because of or behind God's existence. So that's a very brief review of what Maimonides has to say about God, and also how that colors the way that this philosopher, that the Rambam, reads the Torah. As we open our third session today, for those who have the packet, we are, sorry, I had it in front of me and now I don't. We are on page 18. We're going to skip over the section that's about prophecy. We just can't do everything here. And we're going to go straight to this important question. Does God care about you? So now, why would we be asking a question, does God care about you? if we look at what Jewish tradition has to say, the answer seems obvious. God cares about human beings. God, in as far as the Torah is concerned, the way that the Torah describes God, God is involved with people. That is to say, God commands that we behave in certain ways. God chooses certain people and certain peoples and certain people over other people. God is involved in the workings of the world. So why then would Maimonides be asking a question like, is there divine providence? Does God care about you? And one of the reasons he's asking that question is that philosophers that he was reading were also asking that question. People like Aristotle, who have come up with this idea of such a remote God, a God who is so remote, so distant, so far away, that they're asking questions like, does God care about us? And for some of those philosophers, the answer is no. What God does is simply to contemplate God's self. God is the first cause. God is the prime mover. God is the sort of the cause behind all other causes. But that doesn't mean that God necessarily is involved in your day-to-day life, or is here, or can answer prayers, or is present when you need God. That doesn't necessarily mean that. So Maimonides rightly asks a question, which is, well, he doesn't ask it, this is me, but he doesn't ask it this way. But essentially the question he's asking is, does God care about us? Is there divine providence? Is there contact from God's side, from God's perspective toward us? And it may not surprise you to learn that the way Maimonides goes about answering this question is to list 5 different theories and then dispel all 5 of them. Right? Disagree with all 5 of them. Well, at least with 4, and probably with the 5th as well. So what I want to do is I want to sort of race through the 5 theories and get to what Maimonides has to say about this question. But before I do that, I want to ask you this question. Does God care about you? Does God have a sense of caring about you, or a sense of relationship with you as an individual? So I don't know if anybody wants to either put it in the chat or very quickly give us a quick sense of your answer to that. Anne, go ahead.
If God didn't care about us, we would not have the Torah and we would not know how to live.
Okay, thank you, Anne. Other thoughts on this question? Ira, go ahead, or Janice.
Well, if you're talking about like the Torah, giving us the Torah, as was just said, that's a communal caring. If you want to start individual caring, I think that's where the philosophers had a lot to say, not only Maimonides, but for me, does God personally look after a single individual? I'm not so sure.
Okay.
I'm not willing to say yes, but I'm not willing to say no. I mean, after all, we do say prayers for health, well-being, at the end of life, the Dewey and Shema. But is God listening to that one person? I'd have to go back to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob too. The one God that watched over them until the universal God. And I think today we're more into the universal.
Okay, so Ira has done something important. Ira has differentiated for us between communal providence and individual providence. Does God care about me as an individual versus does God care about us as a community or us as a species or something like that? Maimonides is actually going to make a similar distinction. So I see Alex and then I see Peter and Joy. Go ahead, Alex.
Rob, I think that your question is very tricky because I don't think that there is a possibility for human beings, three-dimensional, forward-looking in time beings, to answer what does God care about, for a moment ignoring whether God cares about me. I can talk about the reverse, whether we care about God and whether we think, whether we let God in our lives, but we really don't know what happens in the reverse. and there's probably no way to know what happens in the reverse. There's no, and by the way, by know, I mean the scientific knowledge, right? Provable, repeatable through experience, etc. So I don't think that there is a way to know that.
Okay, thank you. Peter and Joy, and then Sandy.
I think the answer to your question is, well, there is no answer to your question because it depends on how you personally define God. What is God? And everybody defines God in their own way. And if you define God in a way that you can accept the fact that God cares about you, then the answer is yes. And if you define God in the way that God doesn't, then the answer is no. And I think I'm agreeing very strongly with what Alex just said.
Mm-hmm. I agree. I think this could be deeply individual. I also see Phil saying, to me, it's not really about what we know, it's more about what we believe. A similar message, right? This is individual. Sandy and then Nicole.
Rabbi, I'm in there too.
Oh, sorry, go ahead, Joy.
I think a lot of it has to do with personal experience. I personally feel that God does care about me. My life experiences says that when I was born, I was supposed to die. But in fact, he sent a doctor that fixed me. And secondly, I know that God sent an angel to us when our house was on fire, and he got us out of that house. So there's no doubt in my mind that God cares about me.
Thank you, Joy. Beautiful. Sandy and then Nicole, and then we'll take a look at what the Rambam has to say.
So I've actually been thinking partially a little bit about this for about the last month and a half, and thinking about the word hineni. And I think what I've come to for the moment is that when I say hineni or here I am, I'm not just saying that to God. God is actually saying that back to me.
That's beautiful. Thank you, Sandy. I love that. Nicole.
Yeah, I don't think I believe in a God that cares, but I do believe in a power that we, I think, mobilize when we do the things that we think about in relation to God, like when we adopt postures of humility, or when we are kind to each other, or other things that we think about as being godly. Like, I think that those actions mobilize resources towards what we care about. So I think that sometimes we channel that idea of God caring about us, but into by caring about something and acting in what we think about as a godly way.
Thank you. So we've had about 5 or 6 really different answers here, right? And so we can see how deeply individual this is based on, what is your sense of God's being. For Maimonides, whose God is relatively distant, relatively impersonal, in the sense that Maimonides' God is not a person, it would be hard to think of how God would personally care about me if God is not if God is so distant and impersonal. And so what we're going to see is that Maimonides actually very creatively rethinks the idea of providence, the idea that God is involved in our lives or cares about us in a way that's more in tune, more in line with that. So the first thing he does is he goes through several different theories of providence. I'll just kind of race through these, but they're going to become important later. Theory 1 is that there is no providence at all for anything in the universe. All parts of the universe, the heavens and what they contain, owe their origin to accident and chance. There exists no being that rules and governs them or provides for them. So Maimonides attributes this to the Greek thinker Epicurus. By the way, so for the rabbis, this is the sort of the epitome of atheism. The rabbis of the Talmud, the word that the rabbis use for heretic is actually apikoros, which is the Aramaicized version of Epicurean. That following the thinking of Epicurus, the rabbis say this is when people abandon or reject Judaism. This is what they're thinking. They say in Hebrew, "Ein din ve'ein dayan." There's no justice and there's no judge. In other words, this is atheism. There is no God. That's theory number 1 of whether God cares about me. No, because there's nothing there. That's theory number one. Theory number two, whilst one part of the universe owes its existence to providence and is under the control of a ruler or governor, another part is left to chance. In other words, God cares about certain parts of the universe, but not all parts of the universe. And this most often looks like God cares about everything. They would have described it as sublunar, the above lunar world and the sublunar world. That, everything that's below the moon, which essentially was the human world, God doesn't care about. But what's up there, God does care about. Right? God is sort of managing the heavens, but not what's here on earth. Or God cares about humans, but not about ants or gnats or whales, or God cares about me, Jews, but not non-Jews. God cares about some people but not others. God cares about some species but not others. These are all versions of this theory number two, that there's providence in certain parts of the universe, but not in all parts of the universe. And by the way, God's providence is not only whether God cares, but also about whether God is involved in what happens to you. If something happens to me, can that in some way be attributed to God's will, either through direct action or through God's reward or punishment, or through, in some way, is God somehow involved in what happens to me? Theory number two, for some things but not other things, essentially. Theory number three, he says, this theory is the reverse of the second. According to this theory, there is nothing in the whole universe, neither a class nor an individual being, that is due to choice. Everything is the result of will, intention, and rule. God cares about everything. God is involved in everything that happens in the universe. From whether I sneeze today to whether I accidentally step on an ant tomorrow and that ant dies, to the existence of the law of gravity. God is involved in everything. Maimonides attributes this to some of the Muslim thinkers, and he criticizes it for leading to the notion of predestination, that everything is predestined, that there is no free will, that there is no there isn't the ability to make your own choices. We'll talk about that a lot more when we talk about Spinoza in April or May. Number four, he says, the theory that man has free will. People have free will. It is therefore intelligible that the law contains commands and prohibitions, with announcements of reward and punishment. All acts of God are due to wisdom. No injustice is found in God, and God does not afflict the good. So theory number four is, God is involved in your life as a human being, in the sense that you have free will. God has given rules. You are to follow those rules. If you follow them properly, you will be rewarded. If you don't follow them properly, you will be punished. So that you as a human being, God is there and present and involved and cares. And your life, what happens to you, is reflective of God's providence. Now, interestingly enough, Maimonides, as you can see here from my notes, he points out apparent absurdities with this law, such as the fact that some people are born with defects, although they have not sinned previously, or the slaughter of the pious, he calls it. In other words, how can we believe that if people, if the innocent suffer and the evil prosper? But Maimonides will, in some ways, basically accept this theory. The theory of reward and punishment, that God is involved in the lives of human beings. Because in some ways, I think he feels like he needs to. Because this is so completely central to traditional Jewish thinking, the idea that God rewards and punishes, that Maimonides doesn't think that he can reject it. So Maimonides will accept the theory of reward and punishment, but as we'll see, by the time we get 2 pages from now, he will so completely rethink it that he will give us a completely different idea of what it is. Ira, I saw your hand up. Did you have a comment?
Yes, but I thought maybe you wanted to get through all 5. But when you were discussing number 2, I was thinking, and can you just scroll back to it for a second? the existence to Providence and under the control of a ruler, and more like Aristotle. And you mentioned that God might, I forgot exactly what you said now, but I was thinking about the concept that, praying before a ball game. Is God going to be a Yankees fan instead of a Mets fan? I don't think we could go that route, that we could say that God is choosing one over the other. But number two certainly leads there. Or players that cross themselves before, the game. Why does it, do we think that God is going to root for me instead of you?
Right.
I just think it's a problem. And I might mention that, I think we started around it, but I would have a real problem with thinking that God saved somebody from an atrocity when you think of all those that weren't saved.
Right.
Yeah. Okay, I'll shut up now.
Right. No, it's Ira. What you're raising is exactly the dilemma that Maimonides is dealing with, and that that we're all dealing with in some way. Judaism teaches us that God cares about you, that there is some kind of providence. Now, we get to believe what we will, but in traditional Jewish thought, in the Torah, there's some kind of an idea that God is present and involved in our lives, and yet we live in this world where some people get cancer and some don't. Right, so how do we square those two ideas with each other? That's exactly what Maimonides is struggling with. Frankly, that's what religion is struggling with, right? That's the source of religion in many ways, is that question that you're asking. So Ira, would you mind reading a bit for us at the bottom where it says Maimonides' belief on divine punishment? He's now going to tell us a little bit about what he thinks.
Sure. Let's see, where are we?
Right.
A belief on divine providence. My opinion on this principle of divine providence, I will now explain to you. In the principle which I now proceed to expound upon or expound, I do not rely on demonstrative proof, but on my conception of the spirit of the divine, of the divine law, and the writings of the prophets. The principle which I accept is far less open to objections and is more reasonable than the opinions mentioned before. It is this in the lower or sublunary portion of the universe, divine providence does not extend to the individual members of the species, except in the case of mankind, peoplekind. It is only in these species that the incidents in the existence of the individual beings, their good and evil fortunes, are the result of justice in accordance with the words. For all his ways are judgment.
All right, I'm going to stop you there. So Maimonides posits that in what he calls the sublunary world, which is essentially the world we live in, right? Not the world of planetary bodies and angels and things like that, but the world we live in, that providence is species-wide for other species. God cares about the continued existence of the penguins, or the whales, or the ants. But God doesn't care about an individual penguin or whale or ant, Maimonides says. But as for human beings, God is involved. God's providence is on you as an individual. Now, we already might take issue with this because, I don't know if we know more than they did. Certainly, we may know more than they did about animals, or we may understand that individual animals have individual personalities and, are not simply a member of a species. We're not so different from other species as maybe we always thought we were as human beings. And so this might be an area where we would take issue with what Maimonides says, that somehow our relationship with God is different than another species. God cares more about me than God cares about one individual dog or whale. I keep coming back to whales because whales are so intelligent, right? Whales are so empathetic. And so, to me as an individual, it doesn't make sense. I don't agree with what Maimonides says here, essentially. But that is the idea that he's working on, that within the human world, God cares about us as individuals. There is some kind of involvement in your world by God as an individual. Peter and Joy, go ahead.
the problem that I have with this is that he in the previous in one of the previous sessions that we had, he basically debunked all the theories about God within the Torah. And yet this particular paragraph that we just read seems to bear out the line in Genesis where man is created and given dominion over all the other species.
That, yes, I agree. Now, I don't know that Maimonides would disagree with that line, with the line that somehow humans are, essentially what that teaches is that human beings are different from other animals because they have something of the divine in them. And when Maimonides talks about the image of God, he understands that to be intellectual. So actually, Peter, that's a great segue into what we're about to read, because what Maimonides understands to be unique about human beings is their intellectual capacity. And ultimately for him, what makes God care about us is that we have that intellectual capacity. And as we're going to see, actually, he believes that the higher your intellectual capacity, the greater the divine providence. Like that God cares about you more, the greater your intellectual capacity. Maimonides was very happy with his own intellectual capacity, so that might be part of where this is coming from. But that's essentially the distinction he's making here, is that God's providence, as we see here, divine providence is connected with divine intellectual influence. And the same beings which are benefited by the latter so as to become intellectual and to comprehend things comprehensible to rational beings are also under the control of divine providence, which examines all their deeds in order to reward or punish them. It may be mere chance that a ship goes down with all her... Well, actually, I won't even read that part. So, because I want to make sure to get through the rest of the text. So, Maimonides has posited here that our connection with God, which he said before is intellectual. Remember the parable of the palace. How do you get into the palace? It's through intellectual capacity. It's through learning, by contemplating the workings of the universe, learning science and then metaphysics, and making your way closer to God. That is actually the route by which we access divine providence. We access God's involvement in our own lives. What does he mean by that? Because I agree with you, Peter, it sounds an awful lot like the stuff that he rejected. Well, what do you mean? How could God not have a face or a back or a hand? And how could none of the language that we use actually refer to God, but God cares about me? How could that be, right? How could Maimonides believe that? Well, don't worry. Put a pin in that, because we're getting to what he actually means by divine providence. So he at least tacitly accepts the idea that people are rewarded and punished based on their actions, because Jewish tradition is so single-mindedly based around the idea of reward and punishment. It's so central to Deuteronomy and to the theology of the rabbis that Maimonides can't reject the idea of reward and punishment. And he also believes that humans have a different level of providence, an individual level of providence, which is based on intellectual capacity, which grows. Let's see if I can get through this part so we can get to the next part, which grows right here. Hence it follows, in accordance with what I have mentioned in the preceding chapter, I'm right here, that the greater the share is in which a person has obtained, the greater the share which a person has obtained of this divine influence, which is intellect, on account of both his physical predisposition and his training, the greater must also be the effect of divine providence upon him. For the action of divine providence is proportional to the endowment of intellect, as has been mentioned above. The relation of divine providence is therefore not the same to all men, to all people. The greater the human perfection a person has attained, the greater the benefit he derives from divine providence. How many of you are offended by the idea that God cares about people who are of a greater intellectual capacity than those who are of a lesser intellectual capacity? I see a few hands going up there. That is in some ways what Maimonides is positing here, that God's providence is greater, because God's providence is intellectual, that those who are of a greater intellectual capacity actually have a greater access to that providence. But let's see what he means by that. I want to start in the middle of this next paragraph where it says the following verse, right? Okay, I'm going to just call in somebody. You can always tell me no if you don't want to read. Rochelle, would you mind reading right here where it says the following? You're muted, Rochelle.
The following verse describes
Sorry, go ahead.
how providence protects good and pious men and abandons fools. He will keep the feet of his saints, and the wicked shall be silent in darkness. For by strength shall no man prevail. When we see that some men escape plagues and mishaps, while others perish by them, we must not attribute this to a difference in the properties of their bodies or in their physical constitution. For by strength shall no man prevail, but it must be attributed to their different degrees of perfection, some approaching God, whilst others moving away from him. Those who approach him are best protected, and he will keep the feet of his saints, but those who keep far away from him are left exposed to what may befall them. There is nothing that could protect them from what might happen. They are like those who walk in darkness and are certain to stumble.
So this drives home this thing that we were troubled by a moment ago, the idea that God is somehow more protective of those who are what he calls more highly perfected, which is to say those who are of greater intellectual capacity, who have engaged in philosophy, who have studied more. Remember that Maimonides believes that this is the route to God. If you remember the parable of the palace, those who are closer to the gates or inside the gates are those who have advanced further in their studies and their understanding of the universe. So we understand why he might think then that God is also closer to them, more involved in their lives. But we also might find it troubling, this idea. I see Nicole, and then I see Alex and Wayne, actually.
Is it not a contradiction that Maimonides spends so much time saying that we can't understand God, and he's now explaining how God divides God's affection between like who gets it and who doesn't? Like, how can both those things be true?
It's a great question. And so it'll be somewhat answered by the time we get to the end of this section, because the spoiler alert here is that in the end, when Maimonides is talking about God caring or God's providence, it actually has much more to do with the way that we think than with anything God is actually doing. So that's what we're getting to, and what will be understood by the time we get to the end of this section, that in fact, the reason he thinks this about intellectual capacity is that he believes that the greater your intellectual capacity, the better you are able to understand the workings of the universe and the priorities of the universe, and the greater sense essentially of, the greater sense of balance, of the way things are supposed to be, you'll have. But we're getting there, don't worry. Alex and then Wayne.
I think that this is problematic. I think that he's going through contortions or logical contortions to explain what ultimately he should have said. The same way I cannot define what is God, I cannot comprehend what verbs actually can God execute, what actions can God execute, and caring is one of those. So the concept of caring when speaking about God makes no sense in human terms. And he would have, scot-free out of this mess. But unfortunately, he's trying to explain what I believe is unexplainable. He's, using his own reasoning from before. The verbs don't make the same sense when talking about God and when talking about people. So the meaning of the concept of caring, be it for animals, for human beings, for intellectuals, or for epsilons, is irrelevant.
Sorry, I was muted. One thing we have to remember here is that Maimonides is not only writing for us. He's not writing for a modern audience that lives after John Locke and Rousseau and is willing to accept an incorporeal God who is an idea, who doesn't do any verbs, right? Maimonides may believe that, but Maimonides also is writing in the context of a tradition that he's trying to defend. Maimonides believes that Judaism is correct, and Judaism says very clearly that God rewards and punishes. And Maimonides also is writing in the context of people who were very troubled by some of his philosophical thoughts. So he's trying to toe a line here. On the one hand, he says, God's providence extends to us as individuals. And on the other hand, as we're going to see in a minute, he says, but that doesn't exactly mean what you thought it meant. So that's where we're getting to. Wayne, go ahead. And then I'd like to read his reading of Job.
So I'll be quick. I was thinking of it more in reverse, that there are people who are gifted and they're very, very talented, and they're definitely superior, and it's genetic. So for example, someone might have a superior intellect. So it would be, well, why does that person have a superior intellect? It must be for a reason. Well, perhaps they have that reason to use their intellect for the betterment of humankind, or someone's gifted with a wonderful singing voice, and that could bring calm and to someone who's in a lot of mental anguish, or an athlete. Why is that person gifted? It gives a chance to be a role model, and in a way, so by people, God is intangible, so you have to go to a person. So basically, God gives the gift of a superiority in order to sort of transcend, to be able to have some hope and to have some betterment. So, and by not doing that, by not fulfilling your gift, you're performing a slander. It's like if you just do drugs or watch YouTube and eat potato chips, and not pursuing your gifts, then you're snubbing God.
Hey, I like YouTube and potato chips, but your point is well taken. Right. So maybe God is not found in whether I got sick or not. Maybe God is somehow found in the abilities we have, right? Or in the capacities that we have. Maimonides is maybe going to say something a little similar. So here's what divine protection really means. This is via his explanation of the book of Job. Now, a very quick background on the book of Job. Job is a book that's in the Bible. It's part of what are called the Ketuvim, or the writings. The basic storyline of the book of Job goes like this. There's a guy named Job. He's an extremely righteous person, very pious. Things are going well for Job. He has children, he has riches, he's doing well. God and the Satan, the adversary, which is where the word Satan comes from, decide to play a little game with Job by taking away everything he has in order to see whether Job will curse God. So his children all die. He loses his fortune. Job loses everything. Then 5 friends come to see Job, and they all try to explain to Job why this thing is happening to him. Why is it that you were a good person, but these really bad things happened to you? The end of the book of Job is essentially God comes down and says something along the lines of, did you really think you could understand my ways? Were you around when I fashioned the deep and created the world? Come on, Job. I'm God. You can't really understand the way things work. So Maimonides is going to use the book of Job to explain what he believes in terms of of whether God is involved in our lives. So he reads. I won't read the first paragraph, but the first paragraph, Maimonides will essentially say, Job originally thought that because all this bad stuff was happening to him, that meant that God didn't care about us at all. As it says here, if the scourge slay suddenly, God, he will laugh at the trial of the innocent. So that's Job saying, God must just be laughing at us. God doesn't care at all. Yet, Job abandoned his very first erroneous opinion. So that's Maimonides saying essentially, Job may have started off saying God doesn't care about us, but Job may have initially said God doesn't care about us, but Job eventually rejected that idea and himself proved that it was an error. It is the opinion, I'm going to read right here. It is the opinion which suggests itself as plausible at first thought, especially in the minds of those who meet with mishaps, well knowing that they have not merited them through sin. So first of all, Maimonides is telling us it's reasonable to think that God doesn't care about us because bad things happen to us. We're mostly good people and bad things happen to us. So we might reasonably believe that God doesn't care about us. I'm here. This is admitted by all, and therefore this opinion was assigned to Job. But he is represented to hold this view only so long as he was without wisdom and knew God only by tradition, in the same manner as religious people generally know him. So Job's holding the view that God doesn't care about us is essentially, this is Job's pre-philosophy opinion. Philosophy, Maimonides will show, Maimonides believes, will show that it can't be true that God is not involved in our lives in any way. As soon as he had acquired the true knowledge of God, he confessed that there is undoubtedly true felicity in the knowledge of God. It is attained by all who acquire that knowledge, and no earthly trouble can disturb it. So long as Job's knowledge of God was based on, I'm going to read right here. So long as Job's knowledge of God was based on tradition and communication, and not on research, he believed that such imaginary good as is possessed in health, riches, and children was the utmost that man can attain. This was the reason why he was in perplexity, and why he uttered the above-mentioned opinions. So, first of all, Maimonides has turned Job into a philosopher. He's said, Job originally thought that God doesn't care about us because it didn't make sense that God cares about us and all this bad stuff happened to me. Then Job studied philosophy. And what did Job discover according to this paragraph? What did Job discover when he studied philosophy? He understood that such imaginary good as is possessed in health, riches, and children is not the utmost that people can attain. In other words, where is God's reward and punishment found in this world? Not in health, riches, and children. God's reward and punishment is not found in what happens to you, whether you get sick, whether you do well in the world, whether you prosper. This is the novelty that Maimonides is giving to us. This is why Maimonides is not really buying into the traditional reward and punishment idea, because he is dispelling the notion that God's providence, that whether God cares about you, is somehow found in how you do in the world, in what happens to you, or what you gain, or whether you have a big family, or whether you make a lot of money, or even whether you get sick or not. That simply is not where God's providence is found. Our problem is that we think God's providence is expressed in what you have and what happens to you. Maimonides says, no, it's not. So all of those four ideas earlier about, whether God cares about us, if you look back at them, Maimonides says all of them hold one basic assumption. The basic assumption is that God's providence is found in health, riches, and children. They may feel different things about that providence. Some of them might say, oh, well, God doesn't care at all. Some might say God cares about some and not others. Some might say God cares about the individual but not the species but not the children. But all of them have a basic assumption that God's providence is found in health, riches, and children, in how well you do in the world. Maimonides rejects that idea. And that is what he brings to this conversation that is new. So I want to begin here at the bottom. By the way, what he does here is as I mentioned before, Job has several friends. I think it's 4 or 5 friends. Maimonides associates each of the one friends with each of the theories that we read about before, and he one by one rejects them all. Now there's one last friend who he knows, who in the book of Job is called Elihu. And Elihu, he says, is going to be what this is really all about. So, Jeff, would you mind reading for us here where it says he describes, and this is the last of Job's friends?
Okay. He says, surely God speaketh in one way, yea, in 2 ways, yet man perceives it not. In a dream, in a vision of the night, when deep sleep falls upon man and slumbers upon the bed, he afterwards supports and illustrates his theory by a description of many natural phenomena such as thunder, lightning, rain, and wind. With these are mixed up accounts of various incidents of life. Example, an account of pestilence contained in the following passage. In a moment they die, and at midnight the people become tumultuous and pass away. Great wars are described in the following verse. He breaks in pieces mighty men without number, and set others in their state. There are many more passages of this kind.
Right, I'll stop you there for a minute, Jeff. So this is quite confusing, as is a lot of what Maimonides writes. Quite confusing, but his point here is this last friend of Job's, Elihu, says something that's going to be important. He says, God speaks in one way, yet man perceives it not. So we don't always understand what God is saying or doing in this world. And his illustration of this idea, as Maimonides goes on to tell us, is natural phenomena such as thunder, lightning, rain, and winds, as well as incidents of life such as pestilence and war and other such things, all the way down to the nature of various kinds of animals down here. So Maimonides essentially says there's a lot in this world that we don't understand. That the stuff that's happening in this world, we don't understand a lot of it. The description, I'm going to read here what he says. The description of all these things serves to impress on our minds that we are unable to comprehend how these transient creatures come into existence, or understand how their natural properties commence to exist, and that these are not like the things that we are able to produce. So somebody earlier, maybe it was Nicole, raised the question of, didn't Maimonides spend a whole lot of time telling us that we can't understand how God works, and now all of a sudden Maimonides is trying to tell us how God works? Well, it turns out he's actually trying to tell us that we don't know how God works. So we don't fully understand all the things that go on around us, natural phenomena, wars and thunder, and how animals come into being, how the world works. We don't understand all of it, much less, Jeff, if you'll go on and read the rest of the paragraph right here.
Yeah, where are we now?
Right here, much less.
Okay. Much less can we compare the manner in which God rules and manages his creatures with the manner in which we rule and manage certain beings. The term management, when applied to God, has not the same meaning in it has applied to us in the same manner, as there is a difference between works of nature and productions of human handicrafts. So there is a difference between God's rule, providence, and indifference to all natural forces, and our rule, providence, and in just a minute, I got a light. Okay, providence and intention in reference to the things in which are the objects of our rules, providence, and intentions. This lesson is the principal object of the whole book of Job. It lays down the principles of faith and recommends us to derive a proof from nature that we should not fall into the error of imagining his knowledge to be similar to ours, or his intentions, providence, and rule similar to ours.
All right, I'm going to stop you there,
Okay.
Jeff. Let's stop there. So what Maimonides has done is he's essentially accepted the basic idea that there is reward and punishment and providence in the world. God is present. God cares about you. But as Maimonides has done with everything else, he says, but that doesn't mean what you think it means. It doesn't mean that, God's governance doesn't mean the same thing as our governance. God's management of the world doesn't mean the same way that we manage animals or manage each other or manage our flocks or whatever. It simply doesn't mean that. What it means instead is this. When we know this, I'm reading right here. When we know this, we shall find everything that may befall us easy to bear. Mishap will create no doubts in our hearts concerning God, whether he knows our affairs or not, whether he provides for us or abandons us. On the contrary, our fate will increase our love of God, as is said in the end of the prophecy. This is from Job. Therefore, I abhor myself and repent concerning the dust and ashes. And as our sages say, the pious do everything out of love and rejoice in their own afflictions. So in the end, God's providence has nothing to do with whether you prosper in this world, whether you make a lot of money, whether you have a lot of children, whether you whether you're healthy, whether you chance to get sick. God's providence has nothing to do with any of those things. God's providence is our capacity to understand that we don't understand God, and to know that getting sick or losing my fortune are not evidence of God's providence, of God's punishment. When we know those things, Maimonides says, essentially, then we will find everything easier to bear. Then we will, we will act out of love toward God rather than believing that God is somehow literally rewarding and punishing us for our actions. Phil, go ahead.
If that's the case, why would he say that we pray to God for healing of people who are sick?
Phil, I'm gonna pay you later, because that's the perfect segue into what we're about to talk to. That's exactly the question then that comes out of that. If Maimonides is painting for us an idea of a God whose involvement in the world is actually through our own intellectual capacity. What is God's involvement? It's the more we learn, the more we're able to put things into perspective, is essentially what God's providence means here, which raises the question that Phil is raising: why pray? Why perform rituals? Why be Jewish? Right? So in the end, God's providence is actually what allows us to become close to God, and study, which is, as far as Maimonides is concerned, is the way we do that. But we might also add that, how do we get closer to God? Through prayer, ritual, relationship, things like that, that it sort of gives us the capacity to weather bad things happening. That's essentially what Maimonides is saying about providence, that God's providence, God's presence, God's closeness, God's involvement is in our capacity to put things into perspective and weather the hard things in the world. Which raises the question that Phil's raising, which is, as you see on the next page, what is the reason for Jewish rituals and commandments? So we've got half an hour left to make our way through these last few pages. Here's the question I would ask you again. And maybe we can use the chat for this. since we're relatively short on time. Why be Jewish? Why perform rituals? Why pray? Why engage in Jewish acts or mitzvot for you? What does it do for you that you do those things, to have those things as part of your life? If you don't mind, share that with us in the chat. I already see. So a couple of people have responded to that already. Cheryl says, we don't know that our rituals won't affect change with respect to God, right? That our rituals may have the capacity to change something about God. I don't know if anybody has anything else to add to that. Why do you perform ritual? Why do you pray? Why do you light candles on a Friday night? What does it do for you? Or does it? Does it do anything for you? Do you do it for a reason, for any reason? Carla says it connects me to my forebears and connects me in turn to my children. So there's a sense of kind of generational passing forward. Cheryl says focus. Phil says makes one feel connected to a larger community. Ira said something similar, community, right? So these are all sort of the reasons for the mitzvot. So there's a long and ongoing debate within Jewish philosophy over whether the commandments have reasons at all. Are there reasons for the commandments? There have been those who have said, somebody said the perpetuation of traditions and the customs of our heritage. There have been those who have said that the commandments have no reasons. They don't need a reason to keep kosher. You don't need a reason to light candles. You do it because God said to do it, because it's a command. What does the word mitzvah mean? Mitzvah means a commandment. I don't ask, I don't ask why I'm commanded to do these things. I simply do them. There have been others who have said every commandment, every Jewish action has a reason behind it. That the commandments exist, the Jewish rituals exist for some kind of reason, that they're supposed to do something for us. If you had to guess, which side of that debate would you think that Maimonides would sit on? Well, those of you, I know we're low on time here, so I'm not going to let a bunch of people answer that question. Those of you who guess that Maimonides sits on the side of that the commandments all have reasons, that's the right answer. Maimonides believes very deeply that everything in Judaism, there's a reason for it. That is to say, we don't just do this stuff because God says so. You don't just pray, you don't just keep kosher because God said so. You keep kosher for some reason. Maimonides is going to try to tell us what the reasons are. Now, that's easy when it comes to something like thou shalt not murder. The reason for that is easy. It's less easy when it comes to something like sacrificing a completely red heifer and then grinding up its ashes into water and sprinkling them onto the priests so that they can be purified to offer sacrifices in a temple. Right? It's not so clear what the reason is for that. So some have come along and said, oh, there's no reason. You just do it because God commanded it. There's certain things that we do because they are the will of God. Maimonides says, no, God doesn't work that way. Everything here, God doesn't need our red heifers and our prayers. Everything we do here has to do with something for us. There are commandments. I'm in the second paragraph here. There are commandments that seem to have no apparent reason, like the prohibition of wearing garments of wool and linen. That's another one. You can't wear linen and wool together. Boiling meat and milk together. The sending of the goat, the scapegoat, into the wilderness on the Day of Atonement. But, he says, our sages generally do not think that such precepts have no cause whatsoever and serve no purpose. For this would lead us to assume that God's actions are purposeless. On the contrary, they hold that even these ordinances have a cause and are certainly intended for some use, although it is not known to us. Now, Maimonides is speaking for the sages. And by the way, he's not being entirely truthful. Some of the sages really do believe that there's no reason given for them. You just do them because God says so. But Maimonides says that the sages don't say that. Maimonides is actually giving his own opinion here with regard to whether the mitzvot, whether Judaism has a purpose. And then he's going to tell us something which is actually quite profound, even though it's quite short. He says here, the general object of the law is twofold: the well-being of the soul and the well-being of the body. Now, the law here, the word here for law is actually Torah. So what he's really saying is the general object of the Torah, the general reason for the existence of the entirety of Judaism is the well-being of the soul and the well-being of the body. Now, this is a short sentence, but it's incredibly profound what Maimonides is saying here. What he's really saying here is that the purpose of Judaism is your own well-being. Everything we do as Jews is actually intended to help you be more well in soul and in body. And he's going to explain what that means, well-being in body and in soul. Alex, would you mind reading for us here, starting where it says the well-being?
The well-being of the soul is promoted by correct opinions communicated to the people according to their capacity. Some of these opinions are therefore imparted in a plain form, others allegorically, because certain opinions are in the plain form too strong for the capacity of the common people. The well-being of the body is established by a proper management of the relations in which we live one to another. This we can attain in two ways. First, by removing all violence from our midst. That is to say, that we do not do everyone as he pleases, desires, or is able to do, but every one of us does that which contributes toward the common welfare. Secondly, by teaching every one of us such good morals as must produce a good social state.
All right, I'm going to stop you there. So, okay, there are two goals for all of Judaism. Goal number one is the well-being of the soul, which he defines as correct opinions communicated to people according to their capacity. In other words, the purpose of Judaism, primary purpose number one, is for us to have some understanding of the nature of the world and of the nature of God. Now, this may not surprise us because we've already read the parallel of the palace, which is coming later in the guide, but we read it at the beginning, which says that the way to God, the way to get to the middle of the palace, is to have some kind of understanding of God's nature. It's to learn science, it's to learn metaphysics, it's to contemplate the existence and the nature of God. So ultimately, the purpose of Judaism is to help us form correct opinions, to help us understand what God is in the universe. The second purpose, the well-being of the body, is accomplished in two different ways. The first way is by what he calls the proper management of the relations in which we live to one another. In other words, by having a peaceful society, we stay healthy and well. So a lot of the commandments, a lot of Judaism, he says, is designed to help us get along. For example, you shall not murder. That's the obvious choice in terms of, a commandment that's designed to help us get along. You need to be well. You need to have well-being of the body in order to be able to contemplate, the existence and the nature of God. So that's important. Also, you need to know good morals. You need to understand the way that one is to live in the world. So ultimately, he's set up here two different goals. What is the purpose of Judaism? It is, number one, to help us understand God, and number two, to help us be well enough that we can accomplish goal number one. So what he's really doing is he's setting up a hierarchy here of goals, and he'll say it. We won't read all of this, but he'll go on essentially to say that goal number one is the primary goal, and goal number two is the means to goal number one. So in the end, the goal of all of Judaism is to help you be well enough that you can engage in the kind of learning and speculation that can help you come closer to God. Remember that God's providence is found in your intellectual capacity to understand what God is. That's how you get into the palace. That's how you get closer to God. That then is the purpose of all of Judaism, to give us a society and a sense of wellness that enables us to be able to engage in that kind of intellectual speculation. Anybody here familiar with Maslow's hierarchy of need? The idea is, some people know it much better than I do, but the idea behind it is that we need to have our basic needs taken care of before we can engage in other things. So if you don't have enough to eat, then you actually can't you can't get a good education, right? You can't, if you don't have shelter, then you can't properly hold down a job, or have or create art, or so in other words, we need these basics taken care of. And the basics that Maimonides is laying out are essentially security and morality, that you need to have a sense of how you're supposed to behave in the world. And once we have that, once those things exist, then we can engage in the kind of learning, the kind of speculation that can bring us closer to God, that can give us that spiritual connection to God, which he believes is really the purpose of Judaism. So I'm right here where it says, "It is clear." And Sandy, would you mind reading this for us right here?
It is clear that the second and superior kind of perfection can only be attained when the first perfection has been acquired. For a person that is suffering from great hunger, thirst, heat, or cold cannot grasp an idea, even if communicated by others, much less can he arrive at it by his or her own reasoning. But when a person is in possession of the first perfection, then he or she may possibly acquire the second perfection, which is undoubtedly of a superior kind and is alone the source of eternal life. The true law, which, as we said, is one, and beside which there is no other law. The law of our teacher Moses has for its purpose to give us the twofold perfection. It aims first at the establishment of good mutual relations among men by removing injustice and creating the noblest feelings. In this way, the people in every land are enabled to stay and continue in one condition, and every one can acquire his or her first perfection. Secondly, it seeks to train us in faith and to impart correct and true opinions when the intellect is sufficiently developed.
Thank you, Sandy. So, in other words, Judaism, as I said before, is designed to give us the basic scenario, or the basic, there's a word I can't come up with right now, situation in which we can improve our intellectual capacity, in which we can do the kind of learning that's necessary to come into contact with God. And so Judaism creates a society in which you can be secure. It creates a morality in which you can grow so that you can ultimately get there. I saw Sarah's question in the chat, which says that still doesn't address why be Jewish. Every religion provides one with a sense of community and commandments. And that's true. Maimonides would argue that Judaism represents the highest conception of God's nature, essentially. That Judaism is the best way for a person to get into the palace, so to speak, to get closer to understanding the nature of God and the nature of the universe, so that Judaism essentially represents the highest conception of this, the best way to go about this. We as modern people, we might not agree with that. We might say, well, there's lots of different ways to get to God, to get to that sense of connection with the oneness of the universe, which really is what Maimonides is talking about, and that Judaism is not the only or even the best of all the ways. It simply represents one way, our way, to do so. Maimonides, if he were here, he would probably argue that Judaism has done it best. Judaism has most purely maintained a sense of monotheism, of God's oneness and uniqueness and otherness in a way that not all other religions have done. So that Judaism really is offering it really is offering a way into the palace, essentially, to use the metaphor that we started off our class with. So ultimately, as far as he's concerned, what is the purpose of everything we do Jewishly? It's actually to help us be well. It's actually to help us be our best so that we can best commune is not quite the right word, but we can best be learners. We can best be growers and come into contact with God and understand the oneness and the unity of everything that is. So everything you do somehow has to play into that. Maimonides will then go through a list of all these mitzvot, of all the things that Jews do, and will essentially give the reasons for all of them. I actually give you a chart here on the last page of the thing of what he says, all the different, these are all categories of mitzvot, right? Not the actual mitzvot, but what is the purpose of the categories of mitzvot in terms of helping us create the situation or the circumstances, that's the word I was looking for, create the circumstances in which we can be the best learners and grow into our building relationship with God. Every one of these has a reason. So, for example, what's the reason for giving tzedakah? He says, well, it's social relationships and it benefits all humanity, which creates the circumstance in which more people can be engaged in intellectual pursuit. What about the laws of theft? Well, that's evident in social relations. What about something like Sabbaths and holy days? For Maimonides, the reason for that mitzvah is to teach certain principles and also to offer bodily recreation. That is to say, when you rest on Shabbat, you refresh yourself, you take care of yourself, you become more well, and therefore you're taking care of your more basic needs so that you can better engage in intellectual speculation and come closer to God. Everything we do here is intended to give us the sense of wellness that can help us to engage in higher intellectual pursuits. Yes, Alex, go ahead.
Shouldn't there be in some of this a guide? I'm not sure how to express this properly, but let me put it in an example. If I engage in bodily recreation and I go all the way just doing that, I'm not approaching God at all, because yes, I may have paved the way, but I'm not going through that way at all. So there has to be something more than just the little snippets in order to then try to do something to approach God or become closer.
Right. Sorry, go ahead.
No, because if I just focus on each of these little things in isolation, they mean nothing possibly from a religious perspective.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I suspect that he believes that the mitzvot will actually bring us closer to wanting to engage with God in that way. If you look down further, for example, the laws of cleanliness and of clean and unclean, the laws surrounding temple sacrifice, they're intended to help build reverence for the sanctuary. He says, if you're doing things that build your sense of reverence, then you're doing things that will make you want to engage in speculation. Remember that for Maimonides, the highest thing that we can do is to engage in intellectual speculation, to think deeply about the world and about God. And, so for essentially what he's saying, he's assuming that most people are following the basics of Judaism, because I think he's living in a world where most Jews are basically keeping kosher and keeping Shabbat and putting on their tefillin every day. But what he's saying is that's not enough. Those are not an end in themselves. They are a means to an end. They are intended to help us be well enough that we can engage in that higher speculation, and that they actually will make us want to think more deeply about God. Now, Alex, maybe you're saying that doesn't make you want to, right? Maybe those things for us don't make us want to engage in all these levels of speculation. Maybe in the end, Jewish ritual doesn't push me toward that. Maimonides believes that it ultimately will, and that the purpose of performing these rituals is to connect us with the powers that will make us want to contemplate God He may not be so far off. When we say that lighting candles connects me with my ancestors and with my children, then we're really actually saying, I feel something larger than myself, right? When we say that, putting on tefillin makes me feel good, what we're actually saying is it connects me with something larger than myself. So if these rituals make us want to connect with something larger than ourselves, then I think Maimonides would say that's the route by which we approach God. And Janice, I see your comment that those who are seeking to meet basic needs will not have the intellect to approach God. It is possibly a little bit of a dangerous argument. Maimonides would argue that it's the responsibility of society to provide for those people so that they have enough, so that they have, the basic needs covered, so that they can engage in speculation, so that they can engage in intellectual pursuit. So Maimonides might have been a good socialist in that sense, where he believed that everybody was entitled to have food on their plate so that they could ultimately have the basic needs in place and want to connect to something larger and have the capacity to do the intellectual work. Peter and Joy?
The problem that I see with all of this is it's a cyclical argument. He starts with the premise that Judaism or Jewish practice is the best. And then he goes ahead and proves Jewish practice is the best. So why is Jewish practice the best? And I mean, why are all the mitzvot so important? Because that they lead to God and the Jewish God. I don't think I said that all that well, but I hope you understand what I meant.
No, I understand the answer the question that you're asking, and it actually points to what I would say is one important difference between us and Maimonides, which is that Maimonides ultimately believes in the divinity of the Torah. Maimonides ultimately believes that Judaism has been given by God, that the Torah is written and handed down by God. He is, in that sense, an Orthodox Jew. That term doesn't exist. There's no such thing as Orthodox Jews 900 years ago in the sense that there is today. But he is, in that sense, not a liberal Jew, right? Maimonides, we might say, well, who says that Judaism is the best way to go about these things? Maybe there's other ways to do it. Maimonides begins with a premise of God has somehow handed down these commandments. He believes in prophecy. We skipped over the prophecy section today because there's only so much we can do in an hour and a half. He believes that God speaks to people through human intellect, that we are able through human intellect to discern God's voice, and that certain people have had the capacity to write down God's will, and that's where Torah comes from. So he's beginning with a premise that the Torah is right and correct, and that his job then is to explicate what the Torah does for us. And that's an important distinction. I'm glad you raised that, Peter, between us and Maimonides, because we may begin from a place of saying, well, the Torah is our attempt to approach God and to find meaning in the universe. That, tefillin, putting on tefillin or wearing tzitzit or keeping kosher is one way to do this. But it's not necessarily the way that God ordained to do this. It's our way of finding meaning in the universe. Maimonides is a progressive in one sense, and with this, actually, we're gonna end. Maimonides believes, we won't read all this text, but he essentially says to us, this is here toward the bottom of page 23 and the top of page 24. He essentially says to us that Judaism has been evolving, that Judaism ultimately, that God ordained Judaism or created Judaism in such a way that we would learn from it and move forward in terms of what Judaism looks like. So here, I actually will read a little bit here. He says, consider how a baby animal gradually grows stronger and can be weaned from its mother's milk. Many precepts in our law are the result of a similar course adopted by the same supreme being. It is, namely, impossible to go suddenly from one extreme to the other. It is therefore, according to the nature of the man, impossible for him to suddenly to discontinue everything to which he has become accustomed. Maimonides says, way back when Judaism came into being, when the Torah was first created, what was the way that people were worshiping their gods, that people were engaging in their religious pursuits? It was through sacrifice. We might look back and say, another person might have looked back and said, well, God wanted sacrifices. God smelled the sacrifices, and God was satiated with the smell of the meat that was being sacrificed. Maimonides says, God doesn't care about whether we slaughter animals and cook them on an altar for God. The reason God ordained it that way is because that's what people were used to. God gave us a way of being Jewish that would be familiar, that would look and feel like what we were used to. And then God put that way of being Jewish only in one sanctuary in Jerusalem, and then God allowed that sanctuary to be destroyed. So that ultimately, that was God's way of progressing Judaism away from idolatry and toward a form of Judaism that looks more like prayer and contemplation and intellectual pursuit. But we couldn't just jump straight from worshiping idols on our high places to prayer and intellectual pursuit. God had to move us there slowly. So in that sense, Maimonides actually is a little bit of a progressive. He believes that Judaism is in evolution, and it's not clear exactly that Maimonides wants to go back to animal sacrifice. He rather seems to believe that God gave us a temple because we needed it then, and then destroyed it because we don't need it anymore. In that sense, maybe Maimonides is the first Reformed Jew, because he believes that Judaism is actually moving forward, is evolving. Now, this points to what is really one of the big questions about Maimonides, which is, what did Maimonides really believe? Maimonides, on the one hand, says God engages in reward and punishment. And on the other hand says, but that really means that you'll have the intellectual capacity to understand that you're not being rewarded and punished. Maimonides on the one hand says, God cares about your sacrifices, and of course, when the Messiah comes, the temple will be rebuilt. And on the other hand, he says, but God allowed the temple to be destroyed so that Judaism could move forward. So it's not always clear, and Maimonides is maybe purposefully, not always clear with which side of that fence he sits on, because he's writing for an audience that he believes would have a very hard time with a radical rejection of some of these traditional notions. So we can read Maimonides as a radical. We can read him as a liberal. We can read him as a Reformed Jew in some ways. And yet, he's also not exactly any of those, because he also believes that God gave the Torah and that God does reward and punish. And ultimately, what I love about Maimonides is that he does straddle that divide. That he teaches us that our job is to learn and to know and to grow, that learning sits at the center of Judaism, but also there's a lot that we can't exactly understand. Jewish practice, for example, is a system, he says, of training and wellness, of training ourselves, to our bodies and souls and societies to be the best that we can possibly be, so that we can pursue intellectual pursuits, which of course is how you reach God. But Maimonides still believes in the divinity of the Torah and in a supernatural God. In fact, Maimonides' God is the very definition of supernatural. Supernatural means something that is above or outside of nature. That's the very definition of what Maimonides has given us. And I think in the end, he balances the importance of learning, that your job is to continue to learn and to study and to try to know more and more, with an awareness that there is quite a bit of mystery out there, that there are things that are awe-inspiring in the universe that we can't exactly know, that to be a Jew is to learn and learn and learn, to come closer to God, to enter the palace by coming closer to a sense of what God is. But to live in the world, he says, is to know that no matter how much you know, no matter how much you learn, you can't actually know everything. That, in the end, is what it is to be perplexed. That's why this is the guide of the perplexed that we're reading here. The perplexity is the sense that we have this obligation to learn, but there's also a lot that we don't know, that we don't understand. And that, for Maimonides, I think, is amazing. It's a source of awe, and it's what keeps us coming back to continue to learn more, even though we know that there's so much we can't know. So with that, I'll end. I want to thank you all for three what to me have been interesting sessions on Maimonides. And I want to ask you if there are questions that you really want answered. Maybe put them in the chat if there are questions you really want answered by our professor in 2 weeks, and I'll convey those questions to him. We'll meet back here again in 2 weeks, 7:30 p.m. on the I think it's the 24th, on March the 3rd, with Professor Kenneth Seeskin of Northwestern University, who will give us an expert and a scholarly view on what we've now spent the last 4.5 hours delving into. So if you have questions, let me know, put them in the chat, please. And thank you. Everybody have a great evening.
Thank you.
Thank you. Take care.